Numbers never lie. People do. Celia Dodd had spent 2 years quietly proving the difference, and tonight, crouched behind a tower of archive boxes in a fireproof document vault on the 14th floor, she was watching the distinction dissolve into something much worse than math. The vault smelled of cedar and old paper and the faint metallic bite of the air recycler. The walls were 3 inches of poured concrete behind a steel door she had managed to seal from the inside. Using the manual override lever she'd noticed exactly once, 2 months ago, when the facilities manager had pointed it out during a fire safety walk. She was grateful now that she'd been bored enough to pay attention. Outside, voices moved down the corridor, 2 of them, maybe 3. She pressed her spine flat against the cold shelf behind her, boxes of quarterly receipts from 2019 cutting into her shoulder blades. Her heels, pointed black pumps she'd been meaning to replace for 6 months, were still on her feet. She'd been too scared to take them off in case she needed to run. She was not going to run. There was nowhere to go. Her phone screen was face down against her thigh. She turned it over now. The glow stung her eyes. 11:47 p.m. She had her contacts open already. Her thumb hovered. She had 3 numbers that mattered in this building. The front desk, which was empty at this hour. IT support, which was useless. And a number filed under a single initial R, no last name, no title, that she had typed in herself the first week of her employment and never actually dialed. She pressed it before she could argue herself out of it. Celia had been hired by the Rhone Group's legitimate holding company, Pinnacle Logistics, 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days ago. She'd needed the job badly enough to take it without asking questions. Her mother's dialysis, her brother's court-mandated rehab program in a facility that accepted actual payments for real treatment, the rent on the apartment she'd been sharing with a roommate who had since left for Portland and a better life. The job paid better than anything her accounting degree had otherwise produced. The office was clean. The work was mostly routine. She'd figured out the rest at the 4-month mark. Not because she'd gone looking, because she was good at her job, and people who are genuinely good with numbers don't scan them, they feel them. The way a pianist hears a note that's slightly off without consciously identifying which key. Celia had started feeling the entries that didn't rhyme with reality. Shell accounts in Delaware with irregular patterns. Wire transfers routed through Cayman subsidiaries for no taxable reason. Invoices for services rendered by companies that did not appear to have any employees or physical addresses. She had considered leaving. She had gone so far as to update her resume. Then her mother had been moved to daily dialysis, and the math on that had ended the conversation cleanly. So she stayed. She did her job. She kept her mouth shut and her head down. She never asked about the heavy men who came through the private elevator. She never looked directly at the man who owned the floor, Graham Rhone. She'd seen him in person exactly 3 times, once in the corridor near the executive suite, once through the glass wall of the conference room during a meeting she had not been invited to, and once in the lobby of the building, early on a Tuesday morning, when he'd stepped off the elevator at the same moment she'd stepped in. He'd held the door. He hadn't looked at her. He was a tall man, built like something had been assembled for a specific and unpleasant purpose. Silver starting at his temples, a scar along the line of his left jaw that caught the overhead light at the wrong angle and disappeared if you looked straight at it. His suits cost more than 4 months of her salary, and he wore them like armor. Nobody had warned her that the man who could end her employment with a single phone call also ran the financial infrastructure of half the organized crime operations in the city. She'd come to understand that on her own, the same way she'd understood everything else here. Through the numbers. The R in her contacts was his direct line. She'd found it on an internal document, memorized it, and entered it into her phone the same day she'd confirmed, beyond any remaining doubt, what she was actually working for. She hadn't been able to explain the impulse at the time. An emergency measure, she'd told herself, a last resort. It was ringing now. Outside the vault, something heavy knocked against the corridor wall. She heard a man's voice, flat and impatient. "She's got to be on this floor. Check the file rooms." 1, ring 2. The Veltri family had sent 3 men. She'd recognized the first one when he stepped off the elevator at 9, after most of the staff had left. A stocky man in an ugly plaid jacket who had been present at a lunch meeting 18 months ago that she'd accidentally walked in on. He'd stared at her the way people stare at a problem they haven't decided what to do with yet. Tonight, when she'd seen him again through the glass partition, she'd understood what he'd decided. She'd grabbed her laptop and walked calmly to the copy room. Then she'd heard the second man's voice through the wall, a sound like gravel shifting, and she'd stopped pretending calm was available. 3 rings. Yeah, the voice that picked up was not polite. It wasn't raised either. It had the exact quality of a sound you'd hear right before something irreversible happened. Low, unhurried, final. Celia had not prepared what to say. She'd had a vague notion of a sentence. "Please help." Or, "I work for you," or "There are men in the building." What came out instead was quieter and more honest than any of those things. "Mr. Rhone," barely a whisper. The word cost her something. "I don't have anyone else to call." Silence on the other end. Not a shocked silence, a listening one. "Who is this?" Not a calibration. "Celia Dodd. I do your accounts receivable." A breath. Outside the vault door, footsteps. Close. "I'm locked in the document vault on 14. There are 3 men in the building. Veltri men, I think." Her voice fractured, just once, along a very small fault line. She pressed it back together. "I think they're here for me specifically. They were at the front of the floor. I don't have my pepper spray. My car keys are at my desk. The only exit they don't have covered is the stairwell on the east end, but I can't get to it without going past." "Stop, 1 word, flat as a ruled line. Are you hurt?" "No." "Are you alone in the vault?" "Yes." "Is the door secured?" "Manual override, yes." A pause. She heard faintly other voices behind him. Whatever he'd been doing before she called, it involved other people in a room that had gone very quiet. "Listen to me." His voice dropped a register, not softer, more concentrated, the way a beam of light narrows through a lens. "Stay in the vault. Do not open the door for anyone. Do not use your phone for anything except this call. Keep this line open." "Okay. I'm on my way." The call didn't end. She heard the shift of his movement through the speaker, the low command of his voice issuing instructions she couldn't fully make out. Then the sound of a door and open air and the distant wet hiss of city traffic. 4 blocks east, in the back room of a restaurant that did not appear on any food delivery app, Graham Rhone had been in the middle of a conversation that should have taken another hour. It no longer mattered. He handed the situation off to Hewitt with 2 sentences and walked out into the rain without his jacket. He'd had the Veltri problem on his radar for 3 weeks. He was aware that Gianni Veltri's people had been sniffing at the edges of his financial operations, looking for the gap between the clean accounts and the real ones, the way a dog works the perimeter of a fence. He'd expected them to move on the docks. He'd prepared for the docks. He had not prepared for them to go after Celia Dodd. He kept the line open on the car speaker as Hewitt drove. He could hear her breathing, measured, controlled, deliberate. Not the breathing of a woman who had shut down, the breathing of a woman managing herself by sheer will and not quite enough margin. "Talk to me," he said, pulling onto the expressway ramp. "Not about them. Tell me something else." A pause, then quietly, "Why?" "Because I need to know your voice is steady." Another pause. When she spoke again, something in her tone had shifted, less fractured at the edges. "I found a discrepancy in a Veltri-adjacent shell account 3 days ago. I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure what it meant." Her voice dropped lower. "I think it means they're bleeding. Their cash flow is contracting. They're not moving on your operation because they're strong. They're moving because they're desperate." He hadn't known that. He filed it immediately. Which account? Harmon Transit LLC, registered Delaware C Corp, but the beneficial ownership traces back through 2 holding layers to a New Jersey entity That's almost certainly Veltry's. The last 4 transfers don't match their stated invoice amounts by a margin that's too consistent to be a counting error. Someone is skimming from inside their own operation, and whoever it is has been doing it for about 7 months. Rhone stared at the wet road ahead of him. In the passenger's seat, Hewitt had stopped watching the speedometer and started paying attention instead. You're telling me the Veltry family has an internal theft problem, and their solution is to come after my bookkeeper. I'm telling you the men in this building tonight are not working for Gianni Veltry. They're working for whoever is stealing from him, and they want records because the trail leads back through some of your account structures. Through me, specifically. I processed 3 of the transactions they need to make disappear. A pause. His name is Bastian Doyle. He runs Veltry's internal courier network. He has access to their cash collection points. He's been at it since January. The car was very quiet. You figured that out tonight, Rhone said, in a vault, in the dark. I didn't have anything else to do. A short exhale. Also, it's who I am. Something shifted in him. He didn't examine it. 4 minutes, he said. Don't move. The black SUV jumped the corner of 5th and Alderman at a speed that sent a delivery cyclists swerving onto the sidewalk. Rhone was out of the vehicle before Hewitt had the engine fully cut. He moved through the lobby, past the empty front desk, past the after-hours security guard, who took one look at Rhone's face and found somewhere else to be, and into the elevator. 14th floor. The doors opened into a corridor with 2 overhead panels blown out. Someone had cut the lighting circuit on this side of the building. Smart, which meant Doyle's man knew the layout. Rhone handed Hewitt the east corridor without words. A look was enough. He found the first man near the copy room. He found the second near the bathroom. Neither encounter took long. The third, a stocky figure in a plaid jacket, was standing outside the vault door with a battery-powered drill in one hand and a phone in the other, working through the manual override housing with the focused irritation of a man running behind schedule. Rhone said nothing. He crossed the distance in 4 strides and ended the conversation with the efficiency of someone who had done this particular arithmetic many times before and arrived at the same answer every time. He stood over the motionless form and looked at the vault door. Celia, his voice was entirely level. It's over. Stand away from the door. A beat of silence. Then the sound of the internal lever releasing, and the steel door swung outward. She looked nothing like he'd expected. In 2 years of seeing her name on documents and her neat, precise handwriting on routing forms, he'd constructed some version of her, the version standing in the vault doorway. One heel snapped off a black pump. Hair partially escaped from its twist. A legal pad clutched against her chest with white-knuckled hands, and the particular expression of someone who had held it together by sheer arithmetic and was now running the calculation on whether she could continue. That version was different. She looked at the man on the floor. She looked at Rhone's hands. Then she looked at his face. "You're bleeding," she said. Her voice was perfectly steady. He looked at his left hand. A small cut across the knuckle, already clotting. "It's minor." She reached into the canvas tote bag hanging from her shoulder. She'd apparently carried it into the vault along with the laptop strapped to her back, and pulled out a travel-sized first aid kit. He stared at it. "Sit down," she said, in the tone of someone who regularly instructed large, dangerous men to complete their expense reports and expected compliance. He sat on a filing cabinet. She opened the kit, took out gauze and antiseptic, and cleaned the cut with the same economical precision she presumably brought to quarterly reconciliations. Her hands didn't shake. He watched them the entire time. "The legal pad," he said. "All the account numbers and routing traces, the full chain from Doyle's shell back through Harmon Transit to the source accounts." She pressed a bandage into place with 2 fingers. "I wrote it down while I was waiting. I thought it might be useful." A pause. "Or I needed something to do with my hands." "It's useful." "Good." She stepped back, capped the antiseptic, and met his eyes. The vault light was harsh and yellow, and it illuminated the fine tension still running through her jaw, the shadows under her eyes that had nothing to do with tonight and everything to do with a lot of nights before it. What happens now? You're not going home tonight. My apartment. If Doyle's people know you processed those transactions, they know your address. He stood. You stay somewhere secure until I've closed this. She was quiet for a moment. He could see her working through the calculation. Variables, risks, cost of each option. The way she processed information was different from most people he observed. Cleaner, like watching a system with no redundant steps. Okay, she said finally, but I need to make one call first. My mother has dialysis at 6 a.m. I need to make sure someone can get her there. He had built his operation on the premise that every person was a variable in an equation, useful, manageable, or a liability requiring removal. He had never found an exception to that rule. He was beginning to suspect he'd been working with incomplete data. Make the call, he said, then we go. His penthouse was on the 43rd floor of a building that appeared, on paper, to belong to a real estate investment trust, with no visible connection to anything Rhone adjacent. The elevator required a key card and a biometric scan. The windows were laminated glass rated to stop a rifle round at standard range. Celia stood at those windows at just past 1 in the morning, her broken heel dangling from 2 fingers, and looked at the city spread out below like a circuit board lit from underneath. You can take the second bedroom, Rhone said from behind her. There's a bathroom. I'll have clothes sent in the morning. The account structure, she said, without turning around. If Doyle is skimming from Veltry's cash collection points, he has to be moving the money somewhere. It doesn't look like Veltry money. He can't deposit it under his own name or any registered entity. He'd be using unaffiliated intermediaries. She turned then. I can find them. If I have access to the same financial databases I use for your accounts, I can trace the outflows inside a day, maybe less. Rhone stood in the center of his own living room, stark, clean lines, nothing warm, a space that looked exactly like the man who occupied it, and looked at her. You want to go after Doyle's money. I want to give you something to leverage. You could go to war with the Veltry family, but you don't actually want to. They control the eastern port contacts, and your shipping operation needs those. You need Gianni Veltry to understand that the problem is Doyle, not you. And the fastest way to make that case is to hand him evidence that Doyle has been robbing him for 7 months. She tilted her head. I can build that case. I just need access and a few hours. He was quiet long enough that she started to look uncertain. You know what I am, he said, not a question. I've known since my 4th month. She met his eyes without flinching. I'm still here. You stayed for the money. Yes, no hesitation. And then I stayed because the work was interesting and the chaos was honest, and I'd rather deal with people who don't pretend. A pause. That's not the same as being comfortable with everything. It's just that discomfort isn't always a reason to leave. Something in his chest shifted. He classified it as a pressure change and moved on. Set up at the dining table, he said. Hewitt will get you the credentials. She worked through the night. Rhone's men came and went. Rue-voiced, hard-eyed, operating with the slightly too careful courtesy of people who'd been told to be careful around her, and she ignored them with the practiced ease of someone who had been managing intimidating men with deadlines and brisk efficiency for 2 years. When she found the first offshore intermediary at 2:40 a.m., she said there in a quiet, satisfied tone that made the 2 men on the other side of the island look at each other. By 4 in the morning, she had traced Doyle's skimmed funds through 5 intermediary layers to a personal holding account in the name of his wife's mother, located in a bank in Wilmington, Delaware. The account held a little over $1.3 million. She had routing numbers, transaction timestamps, and a clean paper chain that would survive scrutiny from anyone who knew what they were looking at. She turned the laptop to face Rhone. He looked at the screen for a long moment without speaking. You could be doing this for someone else, he said finally. Somewhere else. I could have been doing a lot of things. She closed the laptop gently. I wasn't. He sent the documentation to Gianni Veltri's legal intermediary at 4:15 a.m. The response came by 7. 3 sentences, an apology, a disavowal of the men who'd been on the 14th floor, and a proposed meeting time. Doyle was no longer a Veltri problem by mid-afternoon. The war that could have started in a document vault ended in a spreadsheet. Celia was asleep in the second bedroom by the time the final confirmation came through. Deeply asleep. One arm curled under a pillow, still wearing his spare t-shirt that fell past her knees because there'd been nothing else available until morning. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary, then walked back to the kitchen. She was gone before he woke. She'd left a note on the kitchen island, actual handwriting, on paper torn from the legal pad she'd brought from the vault. The note read, "The Harmon transit discrepancy will show up in the Q4 audit if you don't close the account. I'd do it before the 15th, CD. No thank you, no mention of the night, just the next problem to be solved, handed off cleanly." He read it twice, folded it, put it in his jacket pocket. She was at her desk when he walked into the office 3 hours later. Heels replaced, different pair, identical style, hair back up, coffee at her elbow. Whatever she'd filed the previous night into, it was filed. He stopped at the partition outside her workspace. She looked up. "The Harmon account," he said. "I already initiated the closure. You just need to sign the authorization." She slid a form across the desk. "The Q3 reconciliation is also ready for review. There's a notation on page 7 you should look at before you approve." A pause. "Also, you had a 10 a.m. with the Port Authority representative that nobody told me was being rescheduled. I rescheduled it. You're welcome." He looked at her for a moment. "Dodd." "Yes." "You all right?" She considered this. Not the breezy deflection of the question. She actually considered it. In the specific, deliberate way she considered numbers. "I'm fine," she said. "I was scared last night. I'm not good at being scared. I don't like owing people things." A pause. "Thank you. For coming." "You called," he said. "That's not a debt. That's just what happens." She looked at him steadily. The way she looked at a column of figures she was deciding whether to trust. Then she nodded once. The nod she used when something balanced, and picked up her coffee. 6 months later, the name Doyle had been absorbed into the city's longer, quieter list of people who had miscalculated. The Veltri arrangement held. The Eastern Port contacts moved cleanly. The accounts were clean, or clean enough. Celia Dodd's title, as of the first Monday of November, was Director of Financial Operations. The raise had covered the last of her mother's dialysis arrears and then some. She'd stopped updating her resume sometime in September and hadn't noticed until October. She was in the middle of the monthly close when Rhone came and stood in her office doorway. She had an office now, with actual walls, which she'd initially resisted and then admitted was useful when she needed to say difficult things to difficult men without an audience. He leaned against the frame. He never came in without an invitation. She'd noticed that about him early and filed it. "The Houston acquisition closed," he said. "I know. I processed the wire." She didn't look up from her screen. "The holding structure needs cleanup. The third LLC layer is redundant. I'll have a memo by Thursday." "That's not why I'm here." She looked up then. He had the expression she'd started being able to read about a month ago. The one that looked like his default neutral, but wasn't, slightly too still. The scar along his jaw catching the light. "There's a dinner, Thursday. A Belhaven Group event. I need someone there who can read a room and a balance sheet simultaneously. That's a very specific skill set. You have it." She set her pen down, studied him. That's a long way around asking something. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, the closest he came. "Will you come?" he said, "or not?" Celia Dodd had grown up in a house where money was a wound that never fully closed, where she'd learned to read the family finances the way other children read the weather, with constant attention, and the low-grade dread of someone who knew the forecast was usually wrong in the worst direction. She had built her entire adult life out of precision and controlled exposure. She trusted numbers because they didn't have moods. She was careful with people because people always cost more than they projected. She looked at Graham Rhone standing in her doorway, this man she had called from the dark when she had no one else to call, who had come without a single question, except, "Are you hurt?" And she did the math. The math, for the first time she could remember, was not the most important variable in the room. "Thursday," she said. "I'll drive myself." The look he gave her then was not the look of a man who ran his world like a ledger, debt on one side, asset on the other. It was the look of a man who had just encountered a number that didn't fit his existing models and had decided, rather than discarding it, to rebuild the model around it. "I'll pick you up at 7, he said. He left before she could argue. She turned back to her screen. The numbers looked different than they had 5 minutes ago. Not in any way she could quantify, which was the problem, and also, she was starting to understand the point. She saved the file, closed the laptop. Outside the window, the city moved in its usual way, angular, indifferent, lit from below. She had stopped being afraid of it somewhere between the vault door and the morning after, not because it had gotten safer, because she'd finally understood that safety and security were not the same equation, and that the most honest math she'd ever worked with was the one she was still, carefully, in the process of solving. She picked up her coffee. It had gone cold. She drank it anyway. Some numbers you run because you have to. Some you run because the answer, whatever it turns out to be, is the only one that fits the data you actually have. She was already looking forward to Thursday.